Welcome everyone, and welcome to Thinking About Performance Engineering from F1 to Clean Technologies with Caroline Hargrove. Caroline will be talking about how her background in engineering has led to a varied and interesting career, and will discuss some of the challenges towards net zero and how this will shape the next generation of careers in STEM. Caroline joined Ceres in 2021, a world-leading developer of low-cost next-generation fuel cell and green hydrogen technology as Chief Technology Officer. She was previously CTO of Babylon Health, and before that spent 10 years in F1 at McLaren, and then was a founding member of McLaren Applied Technologies, which was set up to exploit McLaren technologies and expertise to new markets. Caroline is a fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineering and was a visiting professor at Oxford from 2015 to 2018, and holds a PhD in applied mechanics from the University of Cambridge. She received a CBE for her services to engineering in 2020. So thank you everyone for coming, and look forward to the talk.
Well, thank you very much, Arabella. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully you can all see this. Yes. So as Arabella said, I'm going to give you a potted history of my academic and career journey, because one thing I wanted to say is you start off in life and you don't know where you're going to end up. And I've been very lucky and have really enjoyed my career so far. But when I started, I had no idea what I wanted to do. In fact, I like math, and that was about how far I could say what I like to do. And there was nobody in my family who was an engineer, so I had no idea what engineering was. So I edged my bets when I was having to decide in university path, and I picked a degree that allowed me to do applied math and mechanical engineering at Queen's University in Canada, where I grew up. And actually, when I started doing this, I realized I really liked the engineering, the problem solving, and I wish I'd known more about engineering at that stage, and which is one of the reasons I do these things, to tell people engineering is cool and it's fun. I then went on to doing a PhD at Cambridge. I was really enjoying doing applied mechanics, doing modeling, simulations. So I've always been a little bit more on the sort of theoretical side of engineering, but I like problem solving. And then I was a lecturer for 4 years at Cambridge, but that wasn't for me. I wanted to do something much more applied, and I got really lucky and got a job in F1 at McLaren. And from there, as you heard Arabella say, I moved on to applied technologies, went on to Babylon. I'm also involved in a small medtech startup, and went on to working in clean tech now. But I'll give you a taste a little bit of this through the slides that are coming, to just say that although this looks like, wow, motor racing, health AI, clean technology, what's the link? But actually it is having a strong background in engineering. There's a lot of commonality, which you might not think about at first. So if I go on to Formula One, when I joined first, I joined to do some simulation of the car. So the idea was we wanted to make the car go faster. If you really want to do something and iterate at a faster pace, you need to be able to model things and work in the virtual. Now, this may be second nature to all of you, but doing that was quite early days when I joined in Formula One, because everything before that had been you build a part and you test it on the track. That's quite slow, actually. So we wanted to do things faster. But of course, things never happen in straight line. And I joined, and within a few months, actually, I was asked if I could go and help on race strategy because of a number of events that have happened and people have moved team and so on. So I was lucky enough to then go racing, and I went to many races. As you can see, it sounds glamorous. It's very tiring. You fly, you go somewhere, and you get up really early and you work all day long and you go to bed late. And that was a lot of that. But what I wanted to give you as a little example is when you're doing race strategy, and this was early days of race strategy, I wanted to show you a little example, a little taster, that the fact that what we had to do, for example, when you did race strategy, was to try to work out how many pit stops should we do, when should we do them, and at the time that I joined, which shows my age, there was refueling. And refueling during a pit stop was the main contributor to the time. So I'm going to show you a little video and watch a pit stop happening, okay? And what we had to do is try to work out when to do this pit stop, how quickly did our team do a pit stop, how much fuel did we need to put in, and then also evaluate the competitors. But just take a little example. So watch this video and tell me whether, you probably won't hear me talk over it, but just kind of watch and see how long it takes and what do people do. Okay, so let me go to this video and get this going. Right, so hopefully you paid attention and you saw lots of people doing loads of things there. You might have even spotted somebody going in and wiping Lewis Hamilton's front visor. There was time to do this, okay? Because the people on the right-hand side of the screen had a big refueling cable and put that in. Now, not long after that, now I'm going to skip in terms of the video because there's a video I could show, but it's quite illustrative. The rules changed and they stopped refueling happening. And you think one rule, stop refueling, therefore you have to have a tank that lasts the whole race and so on. But it had many, many repercussions, and it had repercussions for the mechanics as well. So I'm going to show it to you, and you're going to see four videos in this one. And two of them are the stops from one driver, and the other two are the other driver, but you're going to see four of them, but all from McLaren. So let's have a look at the next. Look at this one. So just have a look. Right, so hopefully you've seen here what a change that rule had. So all of these are 4 different pit stops, and they were done in, on average, about 2.3 seconds. The other one, it was about 7 or 8, and you think, really, that's not that much. It's a huge amount of time in Formula One. And also, if you notice here, people, they knew what they were doing. There was no time for faffing and like getting the visor cleaned up, because ultimately we started asking our mechanics not just to be mechanics, they also needed to be sports people, because suddenly they had to do this repeatedly and effectively each pit stop. So they started training, and they did training like hundreds of pit stops training all the time, because they needed to become essentially athlete and very, very good at what they're doing. But from a race strategy perspective, it changed everything. We had to change our approach. We had to change what it meant, because suddenly it's all about tires and not refueling anymore. And they added new rules on the tires. So this was just a little something to show you that things happen, and you may be comfortable in doing one technology, and something, a disruption happens, and the winners are those, in general, the winners are those who react to that and adapt and take those changes as fast as possible. So this is kind of the philosophy that I really learned in Formula One, that ultimately leads to you being in a good position to do something really exciting. But the picture that you're now looking at is a simulator, and that's what I actually spend most of my time at McLaren doing. So after going racing, I developed simulators. So they're like big video games. They're so much fun. I really, really enjoyed my time. It was the first Formula One simulators. Before that, people were saying, well, it works for aircrafts, but it'll never be good enough. I mean, it's a game. It'll never be good enough for both the drivers and the engineers, because the point of doing a simulator, it was, can we learn enough through putting a driver in there that will make our car go faster and learn about it? And over time it did. And it was super satisfying, even though at times it was very difficult, because you got very direct feedback by the drivers. If they didn't like something, you heard about it. So it also helped on the, building your sort of resilience, because at times you had to have thick skin. They're pretty harsh with their comments, the drivers, but I really enjoyed it. But also at the time when we were developing and working on this, came the 2012 Olympics in London. And I was very, very happy to get involved in this. So as McLaren, we got involved with a number of Olympic sports. And again, if you think about this, the technology that is used in a racing car, some of the stuff is about collecting data, analyzing the data. And if you look under the seat of this rider, and the GB team was also sponsored by Sky, there's a little McLaren box. And that box, we built a little data logger that did a lot more data recording on the bikes than what they had before on the GB team. And the idea was to help the coaches see whether the likes of Victoria Pendleton and so on, whether when they were training, they would improve their whatever it is that they were working on, like they had different regimes. At time they were working on strength training or on power and so on. And getting data means whether or not your program it works. So this is something that was bread and butter to Formula One, but we introduced a number of sports, including sailing and canoeing as well. And we also worked on some Winter Olympic sports. And this is Lizzie Arnold when she won in Sochi, and we helped build the skeleton, which is a frightening sport, by the way. I wouldn't recommend it unless you've got really nerves of steel. They do go at like 135 kilometers an hour head first. So, good luck to them. But whilst we were working with them, we got 3 gold medals. So Amy and Lizzie had it for 2 Olympics in a row. So it was really, really good fun. And we also worked on bicycles. So again, what you learn about carbon fiber and about modeling and simulation and so on, we had Specialized, who, this is interesting, it's a Californian company, and they had already told the market, oh, our next bike is going to be better and lighter and et cetera, and they couldn't make one that had that brief. So they came to see us at McLaren Applied Technologies, and we worked on one, and it was quite a bit nerve-wracking because we weren't going to get paid if we couldn't get it lighter and better. And what was great is it got launched in a race, the Milan-San Remo race in Italy, and the rider, Matt Goss, who rode it for the first time, and he won the race in his first race. So it was a bit of a fairy tale. It was such good fun. So as I told you, I got to work on really cool projects. But we also started applying some of that technology to looking at people. So if you think about modeling cars, drivers, athletes, the leap to patients is not that far. So we started looking at, well, why can we measure? And we did some studies with some pharmaceutical companies about monitoring patients remotely when they are on a clinical trial. So instead of having them just seen once in a while, if you're trying a new drug and you're well instrumented, then you get a lot more information. And so we started working like this, and that got me interested in health. So after a while at McLaren, I was there a long time, I decided that I wanted to try healthcare, and I joined a company called Babylon. And Babylon is on your mobile phone, you have access to a GP, and that is the premise of it. But also the idea was to try to put some AI behind it and get people to fill in some questionnaires and so on, and start looking at what might be your risk of some diseases, and depending on the answers to questions and so on. And we did this was pre-COVID. And when COVID happened, that made a big change to attitudes towards seeing a GP on your phone, because people then had no option but to do that. So it was very interesting to have been in healthcare when COVID hit. But also through this, like many people, one thing that COVID did give me a lot to think about is that I realized, as much as I did enjoy it and worked 3 years in health, I really cared about the planet. And going on my walks during COVID and so on, and listening to all the climate change issues, I thought, maybe this is something I've got to consider actually moving towards. I felt compelled to go work in this. So bear with me, I'm going to share a few slides here. There is this incredible website called Our World in Data. If you don't, if you want to check out all sorts of bits of information, these people have brought this together, and you can just use it and play with it. And I've just got you some stats to show that why I felt so compelled to go into working in clean tech. And you see this big yellow cone at the top here. That is, if we made no changes to our lifestyles currently, this is how much worse the greenhouse gas emissions would be. Luckily, in the orange in the middle is where actually our current policies are going, and the pledges are below that. But really what we need is to get down way more than this at the 2-degree pathways and the 1.5-degree pathway that we're told that will be better. So you can see it's a big job ahead. And one of my goals of today is to try to get you fired up to want to work in this area, because another little bit of information that you might not know, but in the UK, we started emitting CO2 well before many other countries because of the Industrial Revolution. So before many other countries were anywhere near producing any CO2, and we didn't know that CO2 was going to have an impact on the planet, the UK, in the kind of orangey color on here, was producing quite a lot of CO2 per capita. Now, luckily, this is going down dramatically now, but if you look, it's really started to go down dramatically from 2000. That's very recent. And even though you probably weren't born in 2000, by 2010 roughly is when we crossed over with China, and that you were all born then, right? That's a big difference in the sense that we still have quite a big impact on the world on CO2. The US is much higher, but coming down. But many other countries are still rising because they're still developing. And so we have a responsibility, I think, overall, to do some research and do some innovative thinking to try to reduce our emissions. So this picture here, I'm just showing you to say, it may not happen that much in this country anymore, but it certainly happens elsewhere in the world. And this other picture is to show you that we love our steel. For example, my Mac here is my laptop, my MacBook is stainless steel. My phone is stainless steel. There's a lot of steel that we need every day for what this is a very, very polluting industry. Whether or not we do it in the UK or elsewhere, it still uses a lot of energy. So I joined Ceres, as Annabelle told us earlier, and what do we do? And I just thought I'd give you a little bit of a flavor of the technology that Ceres is developing. It was, by the way, a startup from Imperial College. And there are many types of fuel cells, but the fuel cell that Ceres is developing, it lets you take hydrogen, but it also lets you take other fuels like methanol, which can be an e-fuel. So it can be synthetically made, not from fossil fuels. and you bring that in with air, oxygen, and it creates power. So when you hear people talk a lot about hydrogen and hydrogen economy, is that you can actually use hydrogen and air and produce electricity without producing any CO2. And all the different fuel cells will do this. This one has got also other characteristics, but I won't go into the great detail. But one thing I can tell you is it's difficult technology, because on the right-hand side at the top, you can see it's kind of wafer-thin cells, and you put lots of them together to create a stack. But the chemistry is hard. It's hard to build, not just one of, but what we need to save our planet is to have gigawatts of this stuff. And that's a lot of them. Each stack like this is about 5 kilowatt. So you need a lot of them to do a gigawatt. But as I mentioned, the flip side is we need hydrogen. But the good news of technologies like the one we're developing is it can work in reverse. So if you have renewable electricity, you can bring it into an electrolyzer, which is the fuel cell in reverse, and you can actually create hydrogen. So if you have surplus, or you build up your renewable that at night the wind is still blowing, but you may not need much electricity, you can use an electrolyzer to create green hydrogen. And that's why it's called green hydrogen, is that you're not burning fossil fuel to make your hydrogen. But then once you have your hydrogen, you can use it for a number of applications, because when you consuming the hydrogen doesn't create the CO2. There's plenty of infrastructure issues and so on to come, but my message here is this is one technology amongst many that we need to try to decarbonize the planet. And I'm going to leave you with one message that I hope that you will take, is that we need many different approaches to solve our climate crisis. But all of those solutions need a lot of engineers, scientists, physicists, mathematicians, policymakers. I could go on. We need engaged politicians, but we need good communicators, journalists, writers, artists to inspire us into action, into changing the way we live. And that burden, I'm afraid, is also a challenge, but I'm afraid it falls a lot on your shoulder. And I know that you guys, you're our generation that can really make a difference. I'm hoping we're getting things started, but you're going to be really making the big difference. I'm hoping you're going to pick subjects that you'll feel that you can have these kind of big impacts. So that's it for me. So I'll stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Caroline. That was a really interesting and inspiring talk. So now we'll get started with some questions. Thank you.
Okay, so firstly, with the clean technology, it's obviously very hard and expensive probably to apply it to different things. And when you have big corporations like TNCs, like Coke or Nike, who are gonna rely heavily on these like fossil fuels, how do you think we can like enforce them to make sure that they move towards clean technology? Because they're gonna think mainly about profit and not take into account how much they're impacting the environment. And as much as individuals might work towards using cleaner tech, if big companies aren't, then there's still like a huge problem. So I don't know what you thought about that.
That's a really good question, Kelechi. And one thing I can say is that there are two sides to this. One of them, when it's a product that is a consumer product, we can, as consumers, we can actually vote with our feet and not actually buy and boycott a product. Now, often that's hard if people really like this product, but we can do that. We can have an impact on what people buy. But also the good news is of the countries that have signed up to the resolutions, what it means is all the big companies that are listed on the stock market, they have obligation, and they have obligation to show how much they pollute and so on. And that's starting to add some transparency, and investors will want them to do something good. Now, it's not going to happen super quick, because these things they take a while to change your processes and so on. But pressure is starting. And, you know, the impact that Greta has is huge, because it made people think, hang on, you know, what are we doing about this? And are we holding our businesses and big corporation to account? And it's surprising how much the impact of bad publicity, social media and things like that, if people say something that is saying, look, that I don't want to use that product because it pollutes too much, it has a big impact. They don't like it. People don't like working at a company that also is not seen to do something good. So they'll struggle to recruit the best people. So, you know, there is something you can do about it.
Thank you. So we have a question from a viewer. They've asked, how would we make cars still fun to use and still eco-friendly? So I suppose where Kelechi looked at incentivizing the big corporations, how do we incentivize individuals to kind of like make use of this new, cleaner technology?
I have to say that the good news here for all people who like driving, and if you haven't driven yet and you start driving, I hope you will agree with me, driving electric cars is fun. It's great fun. In fact, it's more fun than driving a normal car. At McLaren, when we were building supercars, we deliberately put in electric engines to add this fun bit at the start, because the acceleration of electric cars is phenomenal. So it's, I shouldn't be saying this because I don't encourage people to drive too fast, but from an acceleration and being in control, electric cars are great fun to drive. Because they're direct drive, essentially, you don't have, they're much simpler than having a complex internal combustion engine that has a clutch at the start and so on and so forth. So actually, I would say this is quite an easy one. Once you've driven an electric car, you realize it's actually good fun. And I have kids that are 18 and 20, and they've learned to drive, and they now both have their license. And they wanted to learn to drive manual, but we have an electric car and that's all I've got. So I thought that's what you're going to have to learn, but hopefully that's all you will ever drive, because that means that we are cleaning up the emissions and so on.
Thank you. Another viewer asked, how did you manage to get into working in F1 and people who might want to use their maths and physics in other interesting fields like that?
Well, that's, you know, I think there's a famous quote, I think it's Michael Jordan or some big sportsman who said, you know, the better I got, the luckier I got in my sport. There's luck, but you make your luck. So I think I was very lucky to get these roles, but I looked and I inquired, and I wanted to do something cool with the math that I'd done and so on. And I read magazines and saw that McLaren were hiring people, and I applied. And you know, you have to put yourself forward for these things. I wasn't a Formula One nuts, but I liked it, and I loved the fact that it was solving cool problems, and I wanted to do that. And people like working with people who have drive and energy and like what they do. And if you put yourself forward and you've got the qualification, you know, at the moment, I'm constantly, you know, I'm telling you guys to do this because, you know, I'm hiring, and I want to hire people who not only are good, but are committed and really want to solve a problem. Then so much more fun, because, you know, work is going to be a long part of your job. If it's not fun, you know, whereas, you know, I always felt like, that's why I stayed a long time in McLaren, because I really liked what I did. And when you love your job, then you think, why should I change? Eventually you think, oh, life is, you know, I better do more things. But I'm glad, and I wouldn't, you know, I loved every minute of it, and I would go back and do it again.
So another viewer has asked, do you see a day when electric engines are implemented in all motorsports? So obviously at the moment we've got Formula E, but it's not nearly as popular as Formula One. And people always complain, you know, it doesn't sound as good, it's not as interesting to watch. Like, what do you think your response is to that?
Well, there's an intermediate step here, which is synthetic fuels, which is fuels that are not coming from fossil fuels, that are made and recyclable. So you can go there and still therefore have an engine, but what you're putting in is less polluting. Certainly as a net zero, you can capture CO2, and if you bring CO2, for example, with hydrogen, you can make something called methanol, which is another fuel that you can actually put in a combustion engine. So there are ways to do something that are getting us towards the right path, but still makes some of those things enjoyable and so on. But I get it that there's no sound for electric cars, but they are good fun to drive. So I'm not surprised that they're enjoying Formula E.
So back to your work at Babylon, do you think implementing more AI and tech into the health industry will like sort of isolate the older generation who might struggle with using that sort of technology?
That's another excellent question. We thought that would be the case. We were quite worried about this as well, and so on. And actually, interestingly, as people are getting, especially with COVID and having to use technology in order to get closer to people and so on, people have got quite savvy with using online access to things like medical support and so on. And it's not a replacement. What we're saying is there was the study that we did at the time was probably 80% of the time you could talk online to see a doctor. The other 20%, when you need to go, you should go. But once you've had your consultation and you've had an examination, if you need to, you can have a lot of follow-ups online. And that tends to help a lot the older generation too, because if they don't need to get on a bus or get transport to, or drive to a hospital, which often has massive queues or bad parking and so on, there's a lot of positives about being followed more regularly often. And this is what we were trying to do at Babylon. It was also to essentially give more bandwidth to the doctors. The doctors will always be there, but we wanted to give them more bandwidth to see more people. So the stuff that is more mundane could be done, and certain follow-up could be done by AI, so long as there's a doctor in the loop. But if you have AI and a doctor, we felt we could increase the reach and the extent of their influence. We weren't going totally robots, we do believe in what doctors bring us. We were trying to give them a bit more space to concentrate on the cases that need most attention.
So back to your work with kind of, as you're doing now with Ceres, with the increased shortage of semiconductor chips and things necessary for like the electric cars, has there been kind of an increased pressure on your kind of cleaner fuel engines?
Interestingly, to an extent, you're totally right. We're more affected with other supply chain issue than semiconductors, because actually as you saw, it's a bit like a battery, and it doesn't need much of a controller. It works, it's a chemical reaction. And so you do need some control, so you make sure that you have sensors and things are safe, and they have a safe power on and safe shutdown and so on. And when it's running, it's pretty low. So we haven't been affected as much as I feared so far. So we hope it'll continue. But generally, the supply chain issue, it has slowed down processes. So things like we rely a lot on steel. And actually, the idea is also to make our thing recyclable, so that the steel that you make can be reused and used again and so on. And steel is very recyclable if handled well. You still have to get it in the first place. So it's a good question, because we need those technologies, but they're slowed down by the current issues that we have. Certainly the war that is on at the moment shows us how dependent we are on gas coming from Russia. But it also tells us, well, we probably need to accelerate getting clean technologies anyway. So if there can be anything that is remotely positive from any war, it would be at least a bit of push that if we have more resilience on all those systems, it may give less power to some of these countries over others, and in giving everybody a little bit more security of energy. And when you think about it, things like just the solar arrays and wind, solar will be really good in many countries that are actually currently using coal, like India and many places in Africa. There's sun, and much more sun than here, and space to put the solar panels. So there's a lot of countries that will benefit from this. And so, but those ones, again, the supply chain to make them will be affected at the moment.
Okay, thank you. There's like a lot, like the IPCC and like different scientists have given like quite scary projections about like where we could be at the current trend that we're going. Do you think we've gone too far, that we can't go back, especially like with different countries not necessarily following pledges that they've made, or countries in less developed areas not being able to afford renewable energy? Do you think it's like a doable thing that we could work towards getting back to where we need to be?
Yeah, I don't have a crystal ball, but what I would say is we need to believe that that's the case. We need to believe that every effort that we do now will have an impact that will help, because it's amazing how the natural world tends to adapt, but we need to help it, basically. And I do feel that we have a responsibility. That's why I showed the graph. That I feel quite strongly that we polluted earlier. Let's help the solution. And even if there's solutions that we use less in this country and we use them more elsewhere, we need to do that. And as government and as responsibility worldwide, we need to push those innovation and the technology development. And a lot of those will take time, but it's also an opportunity to come up with some really cool different ideas. The way we live now doesn't have to be the way we will live in 10 years time or 20 years time. That doesn't make it worse. It makes it different. If we have autonomous cars because they're driven, it's autonomous cars. One thing that could be useful is that you don't all need to own a car. If we can get the price point down, why would you own a car if you could just get one ordered and come in and use it when you need it, and so on? And that might bring the overall number of cars down. So we might all benefit from this, but that technology needs to be developed and so on. So there are some things that it's hard to tell whether we're doing enough, but I would say we definitely need to try everything that we can.
So you told us a lot about the fuel cell. What other kind of new technologies do you think are like the next step towards this cleaner future?
Definitely batteries in all. When I say batteries, I mean ways of storing energy. That in general is really important, because even if we have loads and loads and loads of, and I read a lot of blogs on this too. I'm like you, Arabella. I like reading on this, and I can see that if we use loads of solar panels in covering many deserts and so on, we could actually produce tons of the electricity that we need. But it's daytime, and then at night, what do you do? So we have to come up with the technologies that will store this. Now, you don't necessarily need to store it in a battery. You could store it as heat. There's different techniques of molten salts that you store your heat and then you use it when you need it. There's also ways that, really basic ways, which have been used for years, of essentially bringing water uphill, right? So you bring your water up and when you have electricity, and then when you need electricity, it's like the wind clocks. You wind it, spend energy winding your clock, and then it it will expand its energy, but then you have to, but the potential energy is a way of storing energy. So being clever about how we do this is very important, because otherwise our renewables will not be so as valuable. We need energy at night as well as during the day. And if it's a day that is not sunny, then what do? So we need to be resilient. We need to think about our buildings. Our buildings should absorb the light, create electricity, and be self-sufficient. We have old stock buildings. How do we turn what is a pretty old house into a house that is a lot more energy efficient? That's a challenge, because we don't want something ugly, but at the same time, it doesn't have to be ugly. How can we do it nicely? And that's again another challenge to solve. And once we solve that, we'll be happier, because we will have nice houses, but they're warmer and it costs us less to heat. So there's, in all of those things, agriculture, how are we more efficient with our agriculture? Should we eat as much meat? There's a lot of stuff that we can all do to make a difference and that have an impact, but that doesn't mean that we should all become vegan. There are ways of doing stuff sustainably, but at the moment we're probably over on an extreme, and we just need to move ourselves somewhere where it's more manageable.
There are a lot of questions on Formula One. A few people asked what sort of engineering or maybe skills and experience they would need in order to get into that field and work there.
So the good news with things like Formula One is they need many different skills. So we used to, and I'm sure it's the same, hire a lot of designers, of course, mechanical engineers to turn those design into parts and systems that work. You need people that do simulations. You'll need people that do the electronics, the power systems. You need people that do the aerodynamics, very important. Essentially, I'll say the kind of chemistry through the tires. That's another thing, that tires are really a weird type of compound that you have to come up with, and ways of doing them efficiently. So you can see so many different skills that are coming in, and you need people also in the marketing department, because ultimately you need to bring in money. You need people that will be involved in managing the health and training of the drivers. So there's a whole ecosystem around a team, and there are many, many skills, but ultimately what you need is to be passionate about what you do, because there's a lot of people who want these jobs, but if you can come across as being good at what you're doing and you love what you're doing, people will want to hire you.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful that answered quite a few questions from the Q&A, so that's very helpful. Thank you. So if I could jump back to your work with Babylon, you've described kind of how the healthcare will remain accessible to the older generations. How did the medical workers themselves, how did the doctors feel about this kind of new internet accessibility?
This is another really, really good question. We had the most vocal people against this technology at first were some doctors, because they thought, nah, it's gonna, it's never going to be good enough. People need to see doctors in person, all of that. And we had people very vocal about this until COVID hit. And then COVID was a massive transformation. And then everyone who didn't believe it realized, well, when you have to, you have to. But that what it showed us is it's not that we want to replace our doctors and just only see them online, but a lot of the time we can. And it's simpler all around. And those people who were the most objecting to it, I think a lot of them came around to the idea that there's a place for this. And again, it's not 100%, it's part of it, but I think there is a place, and especially, interestingly, often on harder to reach communities where there are no doctors somewhere, and they can now access some amazing doctors somewhere else and have the kind of care, or at least the kind of follow-up that otherwise wasn't accessible to them. So, we used to work pre-COVID. Babylon had a big, one of the big community that we were serving was Rwanda. So in Rwanda, we had over kind of 2 million users of it. And people didn't have smartphones, but it was done with just voice rather than video. But it was incredibly popular because it gave them a choice of talking to a doctor, or that often they didn't have. They might have had a local health center that often wasn't manned by medically trained doctors, but it meant that people gain access, at least talking to someone. So the difference is everyone on the planet wants access to medical care. This is something that we all need wherever we are. And it's a leveler to be able to have and use your phone to have access. So I did feel very strongly, as you can hear, that these things are useful, but in the right context and not for everything, and not replacing doctors, but augmenting them.
I don't know how hard of a question this would be to answer, but like when you're like creating new tech, I understand it must take like quite some time because there's different things that come into play with it. Do you think it's being made fast enough, or it could be made fast enough or developed fast enough to deal with like how big the crisis of climate change is at the moment?
Yeah, that's my frustration on a daily basis. The one thing that Formula One gives you is this impression that you can always do everything fast. There's some stuff that you can't, and chemistry is one of them, where so in this fuel cell business, to know whether something lasts for 40,000 hours, because people want to have technology that can just turn on and it's there and it will function. It's tough. It's tough to accelerate the process, and therefore some things take time to develop. But my view on this one is, let's do stuff in parallel. Let's do many of those. We're doing one type of technology. Let's encourage others. And to be honest, we're not worried about competitors because we need so much out there. We need different people to try different ones. At one point, there will be some dominant technologies. We're a long way from that, and we shouldn't worry about it right now. We should just go out there and have many, many different types. And that's our only way of going faster, is to do more.
Thank you. And then this is kind of a two-parter, but where do you feel you've met the most resistance with your clean technologies, and how big a role how do you think like the politicians, the current politicians, the current policymakers are playing in like implementing this?
Oh, such good questions. I don't think necessarily there is resistance these days, because people see we need to do it. But there's a difference between resistance and not being actively engaged in doing it. So I think there's some barriers, and some of the barriers is often people don't know how to transform their industry into something cleaner, and don't know how to go about it in the most efficient way, because we're still nascent in changing some of those. And I think that's where the politicians have a difficult task, because most of them are not engineers. And I wish there were more engineers as politicians, because they would get some of this system thinking, where often we have the way to make a change is to really incentivize not just one group, but incentivize a whole group. So for example, we could decide, you know what, we're gonna do a test, and in the southeast of England, we will connect a lot of our systems so that we create hydrogen, we use it here, we have hydrogen buses because we're going to put some infrastructure. We need to get together in the whole of the different parts of the puzzle and try it out. But that is where the politicians come in, and they need often some incentive, some barriers, removal of barriers for planning permission and things like that to these things. So that's one of our challenge going forward, is to coordinate our efforts to go faster. And when you're not technical, it's hard to see, and then people will often mean well, but not necessarily act in a way that is most conducive. And no one has got the whole truth, because it's difficult. It's a difficult problem. But what they need to do is engage the community of people who work in this area, and and make informed decision and be willing to change. So if they're doing something that isn't quite giving the result that they want, then they have to say, okay, well, we'll now try something different, right? So it's going back to, you know, changes happen, and you're going to be most successful if you can react to it and learn from that. And, you know, it's a reality in everything that we do.
Thank you. As a final question, what would you recommend maybe studying at university, or where you could get work experience, either for working at F1 or going into the clean tech industry?
Well, I think all of them do something you enjoy, for one thing. And often, if you're not sure, take something that is actually quite broad, because if it's broad enough, it will give you options to do one thing or another. Don't specialize too early. Unless you're totally passionate, then go for it. Because we need people who will be experts in one thing and do it really, really well. And we also need T-shaped people who they're expert in one thing, but they're actually quite broad on other stuff. And go into something that, and if you're not sure what you like, try something and then see whether, give it a chance. Do summer placements. A lot of companies, we offer summer placements. We do, and knock at companies to do work experience for 1 week and so on, and shadow some people and see what it feels like, because the world of work and what you can do is so much broader than what you might have seen in your courses so far. And that's why I was trying to illustrate with some pictures. I'd never thought I would do any of these things when I was a student. And then you end up looking back thinking, this is, you know, opportunity after opportunity, this is really fun, you know, and I didn't know that. And I wish I'd been told that earlier on, that you can do all those things, but those things has to match with what you like. But often we don't know what we like until we're exposed to it. So that's why I'm saying, try something reasonably broad. And that's why I try to sell engineering to people, because engineering is a bit like a Swiss Army knife that you have in your pocket. You learn a lot of things, but after that, you can actually try out different areas. And for Formula One, you can actually get at it as well through apprenticeship. And I'm going to plug in apprenticeship here, because Ceres is the same. We're just kicking off an apprenticeship course. You can do engineering through going to university, but you can also do a lot of apprenticeships. And we did a lot of those at McLaren. So if you wanted to be a mechanic or an electrician that did all of our electronics, you can do a lot of that through being paid to study. And you can do that. And often people have then followed on with a university course as well. So there are many different avenues to working in these sectors that are rewarding and interesting. And an apprenticeship can be, for a lot of people, it's often not valued as much, but I tell you, if you talk to apprentices, they love it. So it is something to consider if you think that you want to be paid to learn. So definitely there's a broad range of things that you can do with to get into these kind of industries.
Thank you so much for answering all our questions, and for just an incredible talk that covered so many things, from F1 to health, and then to clean tech. And it was just really interesting to see how like applicable different things are and transferable, like from F1 to the Olympics and like different sports within that. And it's really exciting and quite comforting to know there are so many people like you who are passionate about, you know, creating clean technology that's going to like hopefully move us forward, and like, you know, save us from the current crisis that we're in. So thank you so much for that. And please remember that next week there's going to be thinking about wild crimes. So tune in for that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.